Hello YouTube. This is going to be part of a video series that's important tips for language learning. And I am going to tell you some of the important things, some of the important tips and tools and things that will help you with language learning. No matter what language it is you're learning, these should all be useful to anyone who wants to learn at least one foreign language, whether it's their first language or they're trying to achieve polyglottery and it's maybe their seventh language or something. These are just general tips. And this video today is going to be about attitude. Because believe it or not, having the right attitude is the most important part of learning another language. You know, all too often I see people who are trying to learn another language and they genuinely and sincerely want to learn this language, but they have the wrong attitude. And it inhibits them from learning the language. It prevents them from learning the language. It causes much stress, and then they feel guilt and shame for being inadequate. How come I can't learn a language? How do you do it? You just must have some natural, inherent ability. You know, and I mean, it's really all about attitude. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief personal history of how attitude helped me. And then I'm going to read to you some excerpts from some books who are written by language learners, and they talk about the same thing. So, about me. You know, you have to be open-minded first of all, before you even get interested really in other languages or cultures. And for me, the real age I could say where I became open-minded, or you know, I desired other new ideas and ways of thinking, was when I was 12 years old. And at that time is when I decided to learn German, and that's when I started to learn German. And I became interested in what's outside of my own, you know, comfortable zone. What's outside of Minnesota? What's outside of the United States? What other countries are there out there? That's when I really started thinking. And I think maybe what brought it on for me is the fact that I have a grandmother who always took me traveling when I was a young kid. The first time I traveled out of my state, like far away, was when I was 8 years old, and I went to Washington, D.C., the capital of our country. And I even have memories of being as young as like 1.5, going to South Dakota. And you know, so I've always kind of been jostled around, so to say, you know, traveled around as a young kid. So I think that's part of it for me. But you don't have to travel to be open-minded. By no means necessary. No. The thing is, though, is I wanted to see what was out there. You know, I got a taste of what was out there, so I wanted to learn more. And it's beyond just learning about other languages and cultures. You have to be open-minded to new ideas and new ways of thought. It was also at 12 that I, without realizing it, started to become very interested in philosophy. You know, in different ways of thinking and different ways of looking at things, so to say. And I think this is crucial to language learning, because without having the desire and interest to learn about new ideas, ultimately you won't have, you know, the right tools to learn a language, because you have to be interested, you have to be motivated, and you have to be accepting of new ideas, new patterns, new ways of thought. Period. It's really crucial. So now I'm going to read you a passage, an excerpt from the Polyglot Project, from my own entry to the Polyglot Project. And it's the part about attitude. What methodology you use when learning a language is important, but what is necessary is the right attitude. Attitude is everything. You must have an open mind and be willing to accept a foreign culture and language. Like a parachute, the mind cannot function unless it is open. Also, some people are worried that embracing the foreign language would hurt their identity, or in some sense make them less American, etc. In reality, it just means you are an American who is bilingual and has a special spot in their heart for a foreign culture. It does not make you any less American. Having the love for the culture, the country, and the people is really important in learning any language. It keeps you motivated. I was so motivated to learn German that I would be willing to learn any German word I could come across. I did not care if it was about a subject I was completely uninterested in, because I love the culture and language so much. Maybe you're not necessarily interested in the culture, but you have some other motivation. I know people who want to learn a language simply because their favorite author's because it's their favorite author's mother tongue. And they would want to read their works in the original. Whatever the motivation, it must be there. If you aren't motivated and open-minded, you will not have success. I think that most people forget why language was developed. It was developed for communication. Communication should be your goal when learning a language. Being able to communicate successfully is more important than being perfect. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Epictetus. As adults, we tend to be more afraid of making mistakes when speaking. If you make a mistake, it is far from the end of the world. It may be a little embarrassing, but because it was embarrassing, you will not forget the little mistake you made. Life will go on, and you will have learned something new as well. We don't need to have perfect grammar or perfect pronunciation to be able to effectively communicate in a foreign language. People should focus on communication first, and once they can comfortably communicate, they should work a little on the details of perfecting their language skills. So, the point is, be open-minded, find your motivation, and don't worry about mistakes. Because all too often, we get so worried about making mistakes. And if you worry so much about making mistakes, you'll never learn because you'll be so afraid to speak. So be comfortable with yourself. Be comfortable with the idea that you'll be making mistakes. Now, the next excerpt I'm going to read is from The Way of the Linguist, A Language Learning Odyssey by Steve Kaufman. Even though I am an enthusiastic language learner, I am aware that not everyone wants to communicate in another language or learn about other cultures. It is understandable that many people are happier just using their own language and resist learning a new one. What is unfortunate, however, is that very often people who are trying to learn a second language are also actively resisting it. Meeting a different language and culture can be stressful. It is certainly true that expressing thoughts and feelings in a new language is an intimate activity. Your language reflects your attitudes and personality, and therefore you feel most comfortable in your native language. It is also possible for people to resist a new language as a form of defense of their own language and identity. Some people feel inadequate and exposed when speaking a second language. Some learners actually resent having to speak a new language, while others just find it tiring. People who are used to being able to freely and effectively express themselves in their own language are frustrated at the inability to put their ideas across in a second language. This frustration can show in various ways. People all too often compare the new language to their own, rather than just imitating it and learning it. Why does the new language say things this way? My native language is so much more logical, or elegant, or profound, they will often say, but these feelings simply betray their lack of familiarity with the new language. They are unwilling to relax and enjoy the experience of communicating in a new language, and so they resist it. These reactions are similar to how people may behave when they travel abroad. Whereas eager travelers simply immerse themselves in their destination and enjoy themselves, others are looking for reasons to say that. After all, things are better at home. Either it is the food or the cleanliness, or the weather that confirms them that they were better off at home. Of course, we are always happy to come home from a trip, but why think of it while traveling? Speaking your native language is easier and more relaxing, but why focus on that while trying to communicate in a new language? It is disappointing to see that many learners do not take the advantage of the environments that surround them. It was true of me when I was growing up in Montreal. I found the same when I studied political science at the University of Grenoble, France in the early 1960s. There are so many students from England and the United States who were there to study the French language. They were mostly interested in having a good time with other English-speaking friends. They did not take full advantage of the opportunity living in France. They were not sufficiently motivated to get to know French people. As a result, they did not improve their French as much as they could have. When we first learn to swim, the water can look uninviting. Until we commit ourselves, communicating in a foreign language can be the same. I remember hearing a recent immigrant to Canada tell me that after leaving his homeland, he first lived in Europe. He was invited to go out to drinking with his co-workers, but felt that he did not understand their sense of humor. So he stopped going out with them. He related this incident to me, quite out of context, presumably to convince me or himself that the cultural gap between him and the foreigners was simply too wide to bridge, yet he wanted to improve his English. He did not realize that he had to learn to find a common ground with the foreigners if he hoped to speak other languages fluently. He did not have the attitude of a linguist. It is always easier to stay within your own cultural and linguistic group. I often hear recent immigrants to Vancouver tell me that they really like Vancouver. They can shop in their language, all the information they need is available in their language, there's radio, television, and newspapers in their language, and so forth. The only disadvantage to Vancouver is now they have a poor job because they can't speak English very well. Now whose fault is that? The personal, professional, and cultural opportunities that come from being able to communicate in other languages are obvious. What Steve Kaufman says here is quite true. You have to get rid of all these psychological barriers that get in the way of language learning, like being closed-minded and being afraid to go out there and practice and make mistakes. I mean, you have to go out there and find the people who speak the language. Go immerse yourself. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Just go and do it. That's the most important part. You know? And I'm going to read another passage from the same book. And it's under the section Overcoming Resistance to Language Learning. To become a linguist, you must overcome the different forms of resistance to the new language. It may take a personal relationship or a sudden positive experience to break down this mental block to learning a new culture. I remember an incident in Japan 20 years ago. I was selling lumber for a major Canadian exporter. We were having trouble getting our sawmills to produce the quality that the Japanese customers wanted. We arranged for our senior quality supervisor to come to Japan in order to better understand the customer's needs. The first days were a disaster. Our man was from a small town in Canada and had worked at the lumber grading and quality his whole life. He had definite views on how lumber should be graded and believed that it was not a matter of adjusting our sawmill standards for the needs of customers, but showing the customers why they were wrong. In other words, our senior grader had a closed mind when it came to understanding the views of our customers. One evening, we went out on the town for a few drinks. We went to one of the bars in Japan, where the young ladies provide entertainment in the form of flattery and idle chit-chat. One pretty hostess asked our senior grader if he spoke Japanese. He gave her an intense, star-struck gaze and answered, "No, but I can learn." He had a delightful evening at the bar. From the next day, he started to see the Japanese customer's point of view and were able to develop a new and successful Japanese lumber grade. This is a kind of event that should happen to every learner in order to soften resistance and increase interest in a language. The best opportunity to break down resistance to a new language is to make a friend in that language. So, I agree with that 100%. You know, people often forget what language is all about. It's about the human aspect. Finding a person, a friend, you know, somebody who you could want to communicate. Find a culture that you want to communicate and understand. And you have to be ready, willing to accept, to see things from their point of view, to be open-minded. That is extremely important in language learning, because when you learn a language, you don't just learn the language. You learn the culture of the people who speak the language. Within every language, there is an inherent world view. Their cultural view, how they view the world, and how they categorize it. For instance, we as Americans and as native English speakers and as people of the West, we tend to think of this body part as a hand and an arm. Hand, arm. We make those distinctions with two separate words. But in the Swahili language, they say mkono, and that is this whole part of your body. It's the hand and the arm as one single unit. Mkono. See how there's a difference there? They don't make the distinction between hand and arm. We do. Because for some reason in our society that distinction was important. If you look at Inuits in the Arctic, they live in a geographic location that's very cold. It's a tundra, lots of snow. They make their houses out of snow. They dig in snow. They cut holes in snow and ice to get food and whatnot. They're constantly surrounded by snow. And they use snow for many different things. And they deal with snow on a daily basis. The Inuit language is confirmed to have two separate words for snow. Snow that is in the air and snow that is on the ground. They make that distinction, whereas English speakers do not, because snow is really not important to us. But to them, it's very important. And linguists have even estimated that they have more words for snow, up to, I've heard 8 different words for snow, depending what kind of snow it is, where it is, and all that type of stuff. So when you're learning a language, you have to be open to these new concepts and ideas. There's some words in a language where it introduces an entirely new concept that you've never even heard before. So you have to be ready and willing to accept these new concept, ideas, and categorizations of the reality around us. That is very important in language learning. And I'm going to read you one more excerpt, actually 2 excerpts from this book, The Third Ear, You Can Learn Any Language, by Chris Lonsdale. Jonathan was as sincere as you can be, and he really did want to learn. But it's a bit like somebody coming up to you and saying, I can't learn French because I can't purse my lips. Or I can't speak Hindi because I can't move my head. Or I can't learn Italian because I don't know how to wave my hands around. I'm sure you can imagine a perfect response to Jonathan's comment. It could be something like simply asking, really? Can you hear it now? The slight rising of tone to indicate a question. But is it a truly curious question, or is it a slightly surprised and incredulous question? Because they are different and sound different. Yes, comes the reply, slightly drawn out with a shift to a lower tone, followed by a slight rise in tone, affirmative, and slightly uncertain, to which you can hear in the response, really? A statement marked with a downward inflection of the voice. almost with a touch of exasperation and disbelief. An inkling of understanding begins to emerge in the person who only believed he was tone deaf, when in fact he responds to everyday intonation and speech inflection without any real conscious awareness. Jonathan was running a bad belief pattern that was preventing him from learning. So, he's talking about his friend Jonathan, who said, "I'm tone deaf. I can't understand Chinese." But the reality of it is, he was not tone deaf. There's no such thing as being tone deaf. So I'm going to go back to this passage. The pattern was a simple one. He was accepting a belief that his new language was just too difficult. And of course, he is an intelligent person who had already overcome many challenges in life. He had at least learned one and maybe several languages, but Chinese had him stumped. There had to be a reason. Of course, Chinese is thought as being a tonal language, so because English is not a tonal language, it must be a tone deafness that prevented him from learning. You're stumped. And you can feel better about yourself now because the problem has a name. So it's okay not to get it, but not really. So here again, he's saying, oh, tone deaf language, it's just too difficult. Now that he's come up with a problem, I'm tone deaf. Instead of really trying to figure out, he just automatically assigns a problem and blows it off like, oh, there's just no way, I'm tone deaf. Just no way. You know, the saying goes, if there's a will, there's a way. And the reality is, it's hard to make a distinction between a tonal and non-tonal language. It's on like a spectrum where it could be anywhere, any language can be anywhere in between, from being completely tonal to toneless. There's no such thing at each extremes. There's only stuff in the middle. So, like the example showed in here, in English, we have the word really, and if you go, really, it could be kind of like a question, but if you go, really, then it's more like, are you serious? You know, kind of like a response like, wow. You know, they're different, and it's kind of hard to explain, but tone does make a difference in English, and people just don't even realize that. They don't come to the conscious realization. But the fact is, anybody can learn any language despite whether it's a tonal or non-tonal language. It's all about attitude. You can't like just say, oh, I can't learn because of this or that, you know, it's just impossible. Well, guess what? There are people who are mute, can't speak, who become polyglots, and they learn to read and write many languages. I mean, there's deaf people who learn to read and write many languages. So, it's kind of dumb to say, oh, I can't learn a language, I just simply can't. If there's a will, there's a way. I mean, what comes to mind with me is Helen Keller, who was a blind, deaf person. And yet she was able to learn a language. It might not be a language we've ever known, but it was a language of touch and feel, where they would do certain things, you know, certain touches on her body to communicate with her. And so her language was in that form, but she still learned a language. I mean, no matter what, you can learn a language. I have a relative. He's actually my grandma's brother, so he'd be like my great uncle on my mother's side of the family. And he got in a car accident, and well, you know when you're driving a car, you got the steering wheel here, and you have the windshield in front. Well, on the side, there's that bar that comes down that's in between the windshield and your side window. And he got in a car accident, and his head went right in that bar. And, well, left him brain damaged and mentally ill. He's mentally handicapped now. And he got married to another mentally handicapped woman. And they're both, you know, real nice people. And whenever I go to visit, his wife, she always, like, is curious because, I like German and I can speak German, and she thinks that's fantastic. She's like, oh, I'm 100% German. I'm full-blood German in descent. So she's real proud that she's, German in descent. And I said, well, would you want to learn some German words and stuff? And of course she's like, oh yeah, and got excited. I've actually taught her some German words and phrases, and she actually learned. Of course, since she's mentally handicapped, it took her longer, but the fact is, she still learned. She might not be as capable as us and be able to say as complicated sentences in German, but the fact is, she can still learn. So, some excuse I hear for people is well, I can't even speak English good enough. How could I learn another language? Like, it doesn't matter. We're still communicating, aren't we, in English? So you speak it good enough to communicate. What makes you think you can't speak another language good enough to communicate? It's all about attitude, being open-minded, just at least trying. At least trying. Get rid of all that stuff. Make your mind just open and ready and willing to accept. And look at things from a different perspective. That is the most important part of language learning. Getting your attitude right. Without that, you're just going to lose motivation and not have success. It's a very crucial part. So I know this video is long, but this is an important topic. So I hope that maybe if you did not have the right attitude, you can start to get the right attitude now. Thanks for watching.